get started. So this morning we are pleased to have Laura Garcia from Boston College, who will be delivering her paper, Does God Cooperate with Evil? Laura?
Thank you very much. Okay, thanks very much. I'd like to thank Professor Sturba for the invitation to be here. I felt very honored by it, and I try to take it very seriously, even though moral philosophy is not my bailiwick. Initially, I thought my husband, Jorge Garcia, was going to help me because moral philosophy is his specialty. He turned out to be really busy, and so I was sort of on my own, so I hope you will bear with me. The question, does God cooperate with evil, has an obvious answer for most theists, at least for those who conceive of God as a being with every perfection. On that view, since it is necessarily true that God in no way contributes to evil acts, and cooperating with evil acts contributes to them, God in no way cooperates with evil acts. In this context, the term acts refers to human acts, though presumably acts of angelic persons would receive the same treatment. Throughout this paper, I will use the terms action and act interchangeably. Also, I'm going to use, does God cooperate with evil? They're with, and does God cooperate in evil? I'm going to use those as synonymous. Okay. The most frequent objection to the view that a perfect being exists is known as the problem of evil. In general outline, it goes something like this. Necessarily or probably, a perfect being would not allow certain evils occurring in the universe. Since these evils are present in the universe, however, necessarily or probably, there is no perfect being. The claim that God cooperates with evil is a form of the problem of evil. It might be stated this way. That's in your handout, I believe, as 8 propositions. There is a perfect being, that is, a being who exists necessarily and is necessarily omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. Second, necessarily, a perfect being does not contribute in any way to vicious acts. Positively, vicious acts occur, however. The perfect being then causes or permits vicious acts, and this is because of one. If these occur, whatever occurs in our world is at least permitted by God, if not caused by God, or the perfect being. So therefore, perfect being in 5 causes or permits vicious acts. To cause or permit such acts is to contribute in some way to their occurring. So, I mean, this is kind of tedious, but anyway, you need to go, you can see all the steps. So in the end, then you conclude, necessarily there is no perfect being. Any vicious acts at all, if they occur and they count against God being necessarily a perfect being and so forth, then God's existence will be necessarily impossible, right? It will be impossible that there is such a being. Analyses of cooperation with evil would seem to fall within the province of philosophy, since its principles rely on more comprehensive moral theories and involve concepts like intention, act, cause, and joint agency. Surprisingly, though, the subject is treated almost exclusively by moral theologians in the Catholic tradition. There's no canonical way of stating or interpreting the nature and subspecies of cooperation with evil, however, which complicates the attempt to analyze what is already a complex doctrine. Applying its principles to concrete cases is even more difficult, and theologians working out of the same tradition, the same understanding of cooperation with evil, sometimes use the same example to illustrate distinct and incompatible categories. On the other hand, since the doctrine of cooperation in evil was developed mainly by theologians in the first half of the 20th century, Catholic theologians working in that time, it rests on the moral philosophy of St. Thomas and his analysis of human actions. This does produce many areas of agreement as well among its interpreters. In what follows, I first provide a brief overview of the moral theory I adopt in explicating cooperation with evil and offer some considerations in its favor. Secondly, I propose a theory of intentions with special attention to joint intentions or shared activities. Third section attempts to provide a careful analysis of the doctrine of cooperation in evil, points out some difficulties with it, and offers an alternative theory of cooperation in evil, what I call the revised theory of cooperation in evil. In the fourth and final section, I consider the question whether God cooperates with evil by creating free agents who do vicious and even horrifying things to one another, and defend the view that he does not. So in effect, the paper argues that premise 6 is false in the argument just listed above. All right, so first, the theory of ethics that I am going to presuppose in discussing this question. It's a virtue theory of ethics. Virtue theories in moral philosophy focus on intentions as the key to evaluating human acts as morally virtuous, vicious, or neutral. Some theories define any act that is not vicious as virtuous, in that it contributes something positive to the good of the agent or to others that are affected by the act, while others treat some acts as morally neutral. Since our discussion focuses only on vicious actions, that dispute need not detain us. The moral philosophy I summarize is one extensively developed and defended by J.L.A. Garcia in numerous publications. He characterizes the theory as virtues-based, role-centered, patient-focused or other-focused, and input-driven. Catchy as that is, I'll refer to it as a motivation-based virtue theory, or MVT, not to be confused with MTV. Although, MTV has its interest too, but not in moral philosophy. Maybe in immoral philosophy, I don't know. So MVT treats the intentions and the other motivations behind a human act as a crucial ingredient for determining whether the act is virtuous or vicious. It considers the actual or expected consequences of an act irrelevant to that determination, and so is incompatible with every version of consequentialism. Since it is always wrong to act from vicious motives, MVT also endorses some absolute or exceptionless moral norms. While I cannot describe or defend every aspect of this theory in this context, well, not at all really, but I will limit my discussion to it. I will focus on MVT's account of the role of intentions in evaluating actions as morally permissible or impermissible. I apologize for any mistakes in my explication, but I warned you ahead of time that this is not my specialty. One of the advantages of what Jim asked us to do is that it took us out of our comfort zone a bit, and I think that was overall a good thing. Also terrifying, but good, all right? Good for us, probably good for me anyway. Now, the fundamental moral principle of MVT is that the only proper attitude toward other persons is one of respectful concern or benevolence. The late Pope John Paul II would say the only proper attitude is one of love, but that can be misunderstood. Professor Hare was telling us yesterday, love is sometimes interpreted in a kind of, at a kind of, superficial level. And so if you unpack it more, I think it means something like this: wishing others well for their own sake. This kind of concern involves having a certain stance toward others. So wishing them well, desiring or favoring their genuine good, taking pleasure in benefits they receive, caring about their welfare, and so on. We may divide these mental states into 3 types or modes of favoring. Those are on the handout. Affective, approving, appreciating, admiring, and so forth. Appetitive, wanting, seeking, hoping for. And third, practical, intending, choosing, planning to, and so on. With regard to other people. That is, we want them to do well. We hope that they will flourish. We care when they're suffering. We feel pleasure when they're doing well, and so on. Intending to do something that affects other people should be motivated by these kinds of psychological states, or at least not motivated by their contraries. It's important to bear in mind that one may also fail morally by refraining from acting, perhaps because of insufficient concern or even contempt for another person. In defense of MVT's claim that respectful concern or benevolence is fundamental in moral theory, we may note that it is the attitude we naturally want and hope others will have toward us. Even when they do not know us personally or there is nothing they can do to help, We hope they will at least feel compassion for us when we suffer and take pleasure in our recovery. Further, our ordinary moral evaluation of another's action is based on the attitudes and desires it reflects, or that we believe it reflects, rather than on its effects, its actual effects, or its consistency with the agent's subjective duties. Okay, so it's a little anti-Kantian as well, although I think, at least in the version in which Jorge defends it, sympathetic in some ways also. Probably more sympathetic than a kind of, what Kant criticizes, this kind of teleological view that you're seeking your own good somehow in everything. So we do want others to care about us, even if it doesn't work out, right? Even if their best laid plans gang afterglay. And we feel humiliated when we suspect that a person's seeming concern for us is in fact motivated only by his or her sense of duty. A final consideration supporting MVT is our common sense conviction that only factors within the agent's control are relevant to the moral evaluations of her actions, and the stance toward others that motivates and informs our actions is the only factor we control. Sometimes the act we intend to perform does not ensue due to various sources of interference. The expected consequences of an action play a role in choosing acts most likely to benefit another person. That is, if you're trying to benefit others, care about them, you want to do what you think will actually benefit them, but they are not the locus of the action's moral value. So with the fundamental virtue of benevolence in mind, then, we can understand the cardinal virtues of classical thought as either aspects or preconditions of this attitude. Justice is presupposed by benevolence, since treating others unjustly is deeply incompatible with wishing them well. Courage, temperance, and fortitude are preconditions of acting virtuously, since they enable us to focus on the perceived needs of others rather than on our own self-interested passions and appetites. On the other hand, some virtues found in Aristotle's moral theory are not included in this motivations-based theory. Magnanimity and pride, for example, seem to involve a rather self-satisfied appraisal of one's own excellence. And MVT's key additions to classical virtue theory include compassion, benevolence, attentiveness, and so on. As we have noted, MVT views vicious or evil actions as those that deviate in some way from the concern we owe to others. So an agent acts more or less viciously depending on the distance between that kind of concern and the motives behind their action. Those motives can range from the less vicious, maybe inattention, indifference, neglect, or callousness, to the more vicious, envy, greed, vengeance, or hatred. Intending to gossip about Edna, for example, is more vicious than listening to gossip about her, even though both are morally vicious. Further analysis is needed in order to determine what loving concern requires of us in our day-to-day interactions with others. The motivational virtue theory holds that the shape of a given person-to-person relationship, or the role that we occupy in another person's life, gives more specific content to our moral obligations. Not every social role we occupy is morally significant, of course, but moral evaluation enters in whenever our attitudes about another person affect our behavior toward them and affect them in various ways. Those with obvious importance for moral theory, those roles, include the roles of spouse, parent, child, teacher, friend, co-worker, citizen, and even member of the human family. One is also entrusted with one's own well-being and development, right? Because it's not just one's attitude toward other persons, one's attitude toward persons generally speaking, which includes oneself. Roles with obvious importance for moral theory, I already talked about that. Our sense of what's required of us in each of these roles may lead to some practical dilemmas. I don't think to theoretical dilemmas or genuine conflicts, so that you have to pick the lesser evil or something like that. However, it might be difficult to know which obligation you have in various roles takes priority. But it's important to bear in mind that what we fundamentally owe to others is respectful concern, an attitude toward them, a desire for their well-being, and so on. No one's morally required to do the impossible or to ensure that everyone feels our concern for them. We may be concerned for people that don't feel our concern, that even think we don't care about them, and so on. But our job is not to make them, accept that we care about them. As a concrete example, consider Maria, a mother of 3 who is employed outside the home. Maria's concern for her husband and her children rightly take priority over concern for extended family members, friends, colleagues, and the like. Each of Maria's relationships to others requires the general benevolence she owes to them, simply as fellow human beings. But her children deserve more of her care, time, energy than, say, the Red Sox. I might have to qualify that last claim somewhat, because I'm from Boston, and in Boston, the Sox receive a level of adoration bordering on hyperdulia. Okay? I'm not kidding. All right, so conflicts between the game and the kids are undoubtedly very difficult for some. Maria's intentions toward her children should flow from a deep interest in their well-being and thoughtful attention on how to advance it, since her role in their lives is absolutely crucial for them. So part of it is understanding your role and what it requires. The other part of it, I suppose, is reflection on what someone who has this role vis-a-vis me, or I have the role vis-a-vis them, rightly expects of me. Right? What would they expect from me improperly as my spouse or as a child and so forth? Gives us an idea of what specifically we owe to them. Maria occupies many other roles, of course, and figuring out how to order these roles and the commitments that accompany them requires recognition of the proper claim others have on one's resources. If Maria finds she's too exhausted or distracted to give the right attention to the most important roles in her life, some of the less important ones may need to be adjusted or abandoned. I think women especially tend to overestimate the number of things they're responsible for, in part because their capacity to care for children, whether exercised or not, with respect to their own children. And children are deeply vulnerable to many kinds of harm, and so are persons, generally speaking. And so I think women do, in a way, naturally have this attitude of care for others and desire to help them and the like. And that can lead to frequent meltdowns. Okay, just not speaking for myself, but other people. So one of the advantages, I think practical advantages of this moral theory of MBT is its focus on what others really need rather than on what we would like them to be or would like to be able to do for them. All right, now we're turning to part 2, intentions. A more detailed discussion of intentions here and their role in vicious acts, keeping in mind that intentions for MBT are the essential ingredient in determining whether an agent who acts in a certain way is somehow cooperating with an evil act. Perhaps the most popular analysis of intentions defines them as mental states that settle the question of what to do. All right, I said it was most popular, not the most illuminating. All right, that settle the question of what to do in the sense of deciding to do something, committing to doing it, planning, I'm going to plan to do this. In that sense, I thought this was going to be a lot better. Like, you don't know what to do, and this is going to tell you. An intention will tell you. Of course, it doesn't. It's kind of at the end of that. In the broader sense, right, what to do. It's at the very end of that you actually decide to do something. So intending something is planning to do it or committing to doing it, and intentions follow on deliberation about what to do and choosing one of the available options, since a choice of an act results in an intention to act. While choosing is a mental state, intending is a state of the agent. It's a state of affairs, you might say, the state of intending to perform a particular action, carry out a plan, achieve a goal, and so on. This understanding of intentions captures their role in initiating, sustaining, and guiding actions, and includes the various roles of intellect and will in human actions. The intellect considers what would be good to choose, and then ranks or orders alternative actions or sets of actions, which are the means for attaining that end. The good or end of an agent's action is defined by what she aims at, by doing well on a job interview, getting the dog out of the neighbor's yard, or staging a protest of the local developer who wants to pave paradise and put up a parking lot. This is a reference very few of you will get, but it's for my peers, okay? I can almost not say it without singing it. Pave paradise. Nope. Okay, never mind. Alternative definitions of intentions in terms of beliefs, reasons, or desires alone, desires for a certain thing, beliefs about what would be good to do, I think are inadequate in various ways. If one's strongest desire or strongest combination of desires just is one's intention, then the will is blind, since it's moved toward a good apprehended by reason, but not apprehended, apprehended by reason, not apprehended by reason, sorry, but by passions and the passions and appetites alone. So even if one is conscious, there are certain rational ingredients in it, right? One's conscious of one's desires, aware of their influence they're having, and so forth. In this case, it's not the intellect that really moves the will, but non-rational appetites. On the other hand, if intentions consist only of reasons for acting or beliefs about what would be good to do, the will remains idle, since it's moved by a desire for the good. As St. Thomas puts it, the will is an appetitive power, not a power of the intellect. Deliberations about what to do are guided by reason, but they're also influenced, of course, by mental states like feeling lonely, wanting to get out of the house, physical states like having a broken arm or being high on crystal meth, and circumstances like a dead cell phone battery or the sound of a fire alarm in the background. Factors like these can influence the intellect as it deliberates about what to do, and so influence the resulting intention. Unless they overwhelm one's ability to reason, however, the intellect is aware of them and can decide whether they're important or irrelevant in achieving one's end. Reason is capable of ignoring extrinsic considerations in its deliberations, but at times it's overwhelmed by the other influences that affect the agent. So to whatever extent a person's intentions are necessitated by those influences, they are not properly his intentions, and so not subject to moral evaluation. In Thomas' discussion of human action in the Summa, he describes two ways in which the will is free. Man can will and not will, he says, act and not act, that's the first kind, and he can will this or that, do this or that. So the first is the freedom to act or refrain from acting. The second allows the will to choose among various means for realizing an intended outcome. Since every finite good has some defects or limitations, it can, in principle, be either recommended by the will or rejected, by the intellect, But the advice of reason does not compel the consent of the will. Rather, says Thomas, the will is mistress of its own act. But this would not be so had it not the power to move itself to will. Therefore, the will moves itself. That's a pretty strong statement of kind of self-determination of the will. It sounds like a Chisholm's view of free will. Of course, Thomas says other things on the topic that suggest, one isn't really that the will isn't always a mistress of its own acts. So he can be kind of confusing, but since I'm only a peeping Thomist, as Ralph McInerney would say, I'm not going to try to solve that one either. In free acts, then, the will actualizes itself to intend an act or commit to a plan of action that seeks to attain or realize some good. In the next section, freely cooperating with evil will be divided into formal and material cooperation. So it'd be useful to have some sense of the meaning of these terms as they're used in the theological literature. That distinction draws upon the hylomorphic theory of substances developed by Aristotle and then adopted by St. Thomas. According to that theory, every individual being is composed of form and matter. I'm sure this is familiar to most of you. The form is the principle that gives the thing its nature or essence, that determines the kind of thing it is. The matter is what receives the form, and because of its concreteness, individuates the members of that kind. For example, every human has the same form, rational animality, but humans are composed of both form and matter, so they are individuals with the same nature, but not the same individual. By the way, David Oderberg has fairly recently, written a book called Real Essences, in which he defends this view at great length. He defends it against pretty much every contemporary alternative understanding of substances, and talks about some advantages it has over them. So if you're interested at all in possibly reviving, or at least are you interested in some version of this view of substances, I recommend the book, highly recommend it. So when we apply this theory not to substances now, but to acts of substances, distinguishing among kinds of acts involves observations about what distinguishes acts from relations, accidental qualities, powers, and so forth. Thomas defines an act as the actualization of a power in an agent. For instance, a cat has by nature the power to move from 0 to 60 in less than a second. Okay, that might be an exaggeration. I have 2 cats, that's why I'm saying that. But a given cat may never exercise that power. Anyway, they're fast, is all I can say. They're really fast. Some powers, if you try to put them in a thing to take them to the vet, forget it. All right? All right, now some of our powers are passive, as our capacity to breathe, but others are active, as a capacity to ice skate or learn a language. Powers to act and actions themselves are defined by their end, what they are a capacity for, or what they are directed toward. Humans have the power to act freely, where such acts exercise or actualize the power of the will. In these instances, the will moves itself to act, while involuntary acts are those in which the will is necessitated by something else. Only free acts can be called virtuous or vicious, since they flow from the intentions, attitudes, and desires of the agent, rather than from factors outside the control of the will. Since acts are defined by their ends, or what the intended end, a given act will be defined by the agent's specific intention in acting, in that action, the intention behind that act, that particular act. The end of the act is sometimes called its object in this tradition, or the objective sought by the agent in that act. Since a free act derives its end from one's intention, then, it can be defined only by that intention. By implication, moral evaluation of a person's acts relies on what the person was aiming at what he or she intended to bring about. Though the will can be directed to a means, to an end, as well as to an end, Thomas claims one cannot aim at both in the same intention, because the means and the end are different goods. Unless, if they're the same good, then of course one act of intention can capture them. However, here's his explanation. Since the end is willed in itself, whereas the means as such are only willed for the end, for the sake of the end, it's evident that the will can be moved to the end without being moved to the means, whereas it cannot be moved to the means as such unless it is moved to the end as well. All right, not in one act of intention, but still. All right, so an agent can intend a means to an end either for its own sake, not as a means to the end, or for the sake of some other end. But if you choose it precisely as a means to the intended end, then St. Thomas would say you intend the end itself in and through intending the means. If you're intending these means as a means to the end, as he puts it, or as a means as such, then it's applied that you also intend the end. In those cases, then the means are willed for the sake of the end, and therefore are characterized by they're the same kind of act in one sense, right? They're because the intention names what kind of act it is. So the intention to do this end, or to achieve the end, and then followed by the intention to use this particular means for the end, which also kind of incorporates the fact that you're committed to the end, and so forth. So those are all, in other words, moral evaluation is going to attend to both of them. Maybe I should put it that way. So if Farouk intends to get cash from the ATM for a movie ticket, his intention to go to the ATM incorporates then his intention to buy a ticket. Other things being equal, it would be hard to reconcile the fact that Farouk went to the ATM for the purpose of buying a ticket with the fact that he did not buy a ticket with the money. Not that one couldn't do that, but it seems odd. It seems, therefore, you'd have to say change his intentions in some way, change the plan. Thomas conceives of human acts as involving at least 5 stages. All right, so those are on your handout as well. Apprehension of an end, this is the intellect, okay? Then desire for that end, counsel or deliberation regarding the means to the end, then desire for the means, and then consent or an intention to act for the means. If deliberation concludes there is a single means to the end, he says, then choice and intention are simultaneous. In fact, they're the same act, he thinks. For these situations, Step 5 simply follows step 4, since a desire can only be realized in one way. But when there's more than one means available, desire for the means requires a choice among those means, the various means, before the agent intends this one or that one. For those cases, there are 6 steps. Step 3, deliberation about the means, leaves one's... I'm not sure I still have these in the right order, but is this making any sense? Oh, okay. Step 3, deliberation about the means, leaves one's option open, so it must be followed by 4, choice of one of the alternatives, followed by 5, desire for that alternative, and 6, intending the means for the end. Now, at first blush, this theory seems far too complicated an account of typical garden variety actions, since they are rarely accompanied by this depth of reflection. All right, when you're up there trying to decide whether you want the pineapple or the strawberries, you find yourself not exactly going through this entire process, you would say, right? Most of us, unless you're odd, okay? Unless there's a lot to be said for each one and so on. All right, so it does seem too complex. Maybe major or difficult decisions follow some such pattern, but grabbing the car keys on the way out the door or petting the cat or whatever just seem to occur very easily, almost instantaneously. The agent may be largely unaware of any of these steps. If asked why the keys are in the refrigerator, she might be able to recapture her train of thought, including where it went off the rails, but it's doubtful she was aware of that at the time of her train of thought. So even though it seems too complicated, I think one response might be that this process often goes on largely unconsciously and very fast. That is, it doesn't necessarily take a lot of reflection. Somehow these are behind one's action, but not necessarily in a carefully reflective sense. All right, now I'd like to turn to shared intentions, because some kinds of cooperation in evil involve sharing the vicious intentions of another agent. So we'll pause briefly to consider how to describe shared intentions or shared actions. Abraham Seshu Roth writes the entry on shared agency in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and he provides a very helpful overview of contemporary theories of how best to describe a group activity or joint undertaking. This subject appears to offer endless opportunities for chisoming. In case you're not familiar with the verb chisoming, then I would like to refer you to the Philosophical Lexicon, which has been recently revised. All right, the Philosophical Lexicon gives various definitions of special philosophical concepts like plantinga, to plantingize or plantinga and so forth, and many others. Okay. So for chism, this is the definition. It's defined as to make repeated small alterations in a definition or example. And the quote is, the illustration is, he started with definition D8 and kept chisoming away at it till he ended up with D8 prime, 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 prime. All right, so this topic is, my experience was that it allowed for much chisoming. All right, people seem to love that part of it. My sense, however, is that the straightforward, intuitive account that Roth begins with is perfectly adequate. That account models joint agency on individual agency. When I act as an individual, I intend what I am doing or going to do. When I participate in a shared activity, I intend what we are doing. I would put this maybe a little differently, since my intention is not exactly what we are doing, but rather that we do something together, or that I do something with you. Roth calls this the we intentions view, but I will refer to it as the minimalist account of group intentions, or magi. All right, I love magi as the name of my particular view. So, all right, why? It's for the wise people. Get it? Okay. A first objection to magi is that no individual can intend the act in a certain way, contend that we act in a certain way, since others' intentions are private mental states under their control. So it seems that intending that we do such and such is intending not just for myself, but for them as well. And therefore, magi is self-evidently false. However, it's not obvious that my intending that we do A presupposes I can intend for someone else. My intention is simply to bring it about or contribute to bringing it about that I and another person or group do A, or do A together. My intention does presuppose that the others will also intend A, otherwise we can't do it together, obviously. But it's not part of my intention to force them to do so or lobby them into doing so. Well, sometimes it might be, but it doesn't have to be. And even if I'm trying to coerce them, I know that I can't intend this for them, which is why I have to lobby them in the first place. If I could just intend for them, that would be easier. Perhaps I carry out my intention that we do A by asking you to help with it. If I'm shopping at the grocery store, cannot reach a box on the top shelf, I might ask you, some kind of abnormally tall person, if you'd get it down for me. Then I intend that we do A, that is, get the box into my hands, and you also intend that we do A. Fortunately, we make a good team on this. However, most action theorists reject magi on the grounds that it entails preposterous consequences. So alternative theories of shared agency usually begin from two or more individual intentions to engage in A, to do A, then develop criteria for weaving these together in such a way that the individuals can be said to be working as a group on the same plan, project, activity, and so on. Now, the individual intentions are called, for this purpose, participatory intentions, since they take the form, I intend to participate in or contribute to A. Since the intentions have to converge on the same action, though, in the right way, not just the same action, but you have to coordinate it and so forth, otherwise you're all just doing A sort of on your own. Definitions of shared agency will require some additional principles. Take the example of a group of people who commit to painting a house, but it turns out that some want to paint it yellow and others want to paint it brown because the neighbor's house is yellow. Since they do not agree on the means to the end of painting the house, the joint activity is stymied. Similarly, if half the group opts out of the project on the grounds the color is just going to be wrong, the shared project falls apart. All right? One way to avoid those kinds of problems is to interpret participatory intentions as conditionals, having the form, I intend to do A on the condition that you intend likewise. So I intend to do A, but on the condition that you also intend A. Of course, if you also have a conditional intention that you intend to do A only if I intend to do A, on the condition that I intend to do A, we have kind of a difficulty, right? We might call this the date night conundrum, characterized by conversations like, what do you want to do? Whatever you want to do. But I want to do what you want to do. And so forth, ad infinitum. Okay, so nothing happens here unless someone chooses an activity in a non-conditional way. A second theory treats participatory intentions as predictive. I intend to do A as long as I can reasonably expect that you will be committed to A as well. Now, this is similar to the conditional intentions view, but does not require that you specifically commit to doing A, only that I can reasonably predict that you will. But on the other hand, maybe I'm really into A and will do it whether or not you commit to it. Then it's not so much that I predict you will intend to A, but I hope you will, or would like it if you did. Perhaps I have 2 tickets to a Red Sox game and intend to go to it. And I also hope that you, as a longtime resident of Beantown, will want to go to the game and will commit to attending the game if I ask you. But I cannot predict the outcome. It could turn out that you are, gasp, a Yankees fan. Horrors of horrors. All right, for Boston fans. I don't know that New York pays as much attention to this rivalry as we do in Boston. All right, it seems then that premising an individual's participation on what others intend will not achieve the desired results. Perhaps instead we should think of participatory intentions as subject to certain normative constraints that A, accompany that participatory intention itself, and B, prevent the kind of intractable conflict that plagued the house painting project. This requires a delicate balance, one would think, between preserving the voluntariness of group participation and ensuring that participants' intentions continue to mesh in a way that allows the project to succeed. Mesh is a favorite term for this because sometimes people say cohere. Coherence is kind of too weak, maybe corresponds to strong, so mesh. All right, I'm not really sure, I haven't looked that up in the dictionary, but anyway, we kind of get the feel of it. They somehow go together in a helpful way for a common end. So one solution then is to interpret participatory intentions to A as committing one in a rather strong sense to subparts of the plan that are agreed upon by the group, perhaps by majority vote. All right, so in painting the house, then, if you commit to the project and the majority thinks we're going to paint it yellow, then you've committed yourself to painting it yellow too. Now, the justification for that requirement draws on an analogy between individual and group deliberation, appealing to the norms of rationality. So the normative element here is supposed to be an intellectual or rational one. And it goes something like this. If I commit to doing A and determine that B is the best way to achieve A, this is my personal intention, then it's irrational for me not to commit to B. Analogously, if I intend to participate in a group activity, A, and the group decides B is the best way to achieve A, it's irrational for me not to intend B. So we'll just assume for now that that characterization of the individual intentions is correct. But that's no reason to think that someone who intends to participate in a joint activity A thereby commits herself to the best way of achieving A. In fact, unless she knows ahead of time that B is the best means to A, she cannot have been intending B in intending A. Perhaps people ask her, look, do you want to help us with the house painting project? She's never painted a house, maybe has no idea what's involved in painting the house, but she says, sure, okay, I'll do what I can. And then it turns out that they want her to climb up to the top level and scrape the paint from the attic. And she goes, well, I didn't know I was signing up for that one. Well, that's what the group's decided. This is going to be your part. All right, you can imagine she would opt out at that point. All right, I'm not going to make it in my time, but I'll go as fast as I can. All right, so the claim that you're subject somehow to these quasi-rational constraints is not plausible. Another proposal, and I'll skip over this part, I believe that basically it's a doomed enterprise, but when you strengthen this to morally normative constraints, it gets much worse. Okay, so the most serious of those is very, very strict. Okay, it says if you commit to a joint activity, then that requires, it's a joint activity, and a joint activity presupposes these conditions, that each member of the group openly and explicitly commits to the action and is explicitly accepted into that by every other member of the group, and one cannot withdraw from the project unless every other member agrees that you can. Right? That is so strong. It's unbelievable that anybody would ever do anything with other people. I would commit to very few joint activities if I knew that this was going to be the upshot of it. So I think trying to build shared agency from individual agency in that way is a doomed individual intentions is doomed enterprise. My suggestion as we go back to the view that there are really not just, we don't start with an intention to A, so you've just got the two-part thing. I think we should go back to the Magi view that we've got a three-part thing. I intend that we do A, right? And then you've sort of incorporated the other person or persons into the intention. So I had a couple examples of this, but I'm going to move on. All right, to cooperation and evil, very complicated doctrine, and it seems like it'd always be a bad thing. It's difficult to see how there could be a morally permissible example of it, in fact. So I heard a theologian say last fall, well, God cooperates with evil. Okay, I was horrified. That sounded really heretical to me. I said, no way. Yes, he does, he tells me. He gives me an example. He was really unhappy about that. I thought, well, let's look at that one then. So this is one of the things that got me motivated to take a look at this doctrine. Definitions of cooperation include such terms as concurrence, agreement, consensus, and the like. So cooperating in evil seems to presuppose at least some endorsement of it, of the end or the goal. But standard theological explanations of cooperation with evil contend that some kinds of cooperation are morally licit, in fact. So in this section, I attempt to describe this theory as it's expounded in the first half of the 20th century by leading Catholic theologians of the day. And of course, some of them continue, right? This criterion actually continues to be applied, especially in medical ethics. So the NCBC, the National Catholic Bioethics Center, has tried to explicate this doctrine, help other hospitals understand it with regard to merging with the secular hospital. Ascension Health, which is the largest network of Catholic hospitals and clinics in the U.S., they have on their website an actually fairly detailed explanation of cooperation and evil. Right? I don't think it's a great one, but it's not bad. All right, so doctors of the church, right? Earlier thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas address some of the same issues, but they don't employ the same terminology. And I think it was employed mainly to deal with these complicated questions arising from advances in especially the biological sciences, reproductive technologies, and the like. So, not exclusively. So it's an attempt to take some moral principles of previous eras and apply them to contemporary issues that weren't envisaged, obviously, before then. All right, so I'm going to skip to the actual definitions. Maybe we'll just use the handout because that's, or I don't have it up here, but anyway, I will use the handout that I have down here somewhere. All right, the first distinction is formal and material cooperation. In formal cooperation, so it's pretty easy. You're acting, you're assisting or furthering another person's end, and their end is morally wrong. It's an evil end or an evil act. And you are in some way trying to foster it or furthering. So in one case, you share their intention for that end. Another case, you share an intention for the means to the end. But, as Aquinas would say, you intend that as a means to the end, is why you're intending it. So this involves you with the evil intention in a way that's always morally forbidden or impermissible. Now, material cooperation, that's the category that's supposed to have some morally permissible versions. All right, and every explication of this theory, traditional explication, actually does say that some cases of material cooperation will be morally permissible. All right, now how to carve out the good from the bad. The first kind, and these all involve you're intending or you're assisting an agent, so in some way intending one of the means to the end, but you're not intending it as a means, and so you are explicitly not intending the end, the evil end that the agent has in mind. But you're intending a means to that end might still be, right, often is, impermissible from a moral point of view. So immediate material cooperation, and this is defined in kind of a vague way, it's an act that directly tends to produce the evil act. It's closely related to the action from a causal point of view. And that is sometimes permitted. All right, the immediate is not so, obviously, not so direct. It's farther back in the causal chain, or it's not as causally effective for producing the end. And also, in all these cases, you don't intend the end. So a lot of times this will be maybe morally impermissible, but sometimes it'll be okay. Now, then we have that's divided further, as you can see, into proximate and remote. All right, in one case, the help is intimately connected with the evil act of the agent. All right, which sounds a lot like just plain immediate material cooperation itself. All right, I'm not going to try to fix that right now. All right, remote, the help given is not intimately connected with the evil act. And that could be sometimes permissible. I mean, I'm just guessing that proximate cooperation is always wrong. This is often not explicitly said in explications of the doctrine. Now, for remote material cooperation, if it's still, we got some that are okay, some that aren't. We have to separate the sheep from the goats here. So that is sometimes itself divided into an action that's necessary for the agent's action, in the sense that, or essential, in the sense that the agent wouldn't do it unless you did your part, or it's unnecessary, in that the act would still be committed whether or not you are in on it. And those kinds of cases, even the unnecessary ones, are sometimes okay. Sometimes at this point you bring in proportionality considerations. Well, how great is the good brought about by your intention, which otherwise could be kind of problematic, compared to the evil of the wrongful act or the evil of your particular contribution to it, which may be pretty small, and so on. Now, there are many differences here, right? Some people think or use proximate and remote to mean the same exact thing as immediate and mediate, which makes some sense. Others treat it as a subdivision of mediate material cooperation. Some treat necessary and unnecessary as on the same level. Some of them view all these distinctions as kind of on the same level in a way. 3 ways you should kind of evaluate your act. And somehow out of the 3 of them, you know, I don't know what happens if the act's necessary, but it's not proximate. You know what I mean? That would be very complicated, but that's how it ends up. And in fact, on some readings, I think Ascension Health's criteria, they explain these very well, and then they say, well, here's some things you should think about for material cooperation, right? You just take the whole category to go, you ask yourself, well, how remote is it? How essential is it? In my view, the necessary thing doesn't work at all. It doesn't help you. It's saying, well, how essential is it? Either would the agent do this without your participation? Well, suppose they would. This doesn't mean your participation isn't a bad thing. All right, maybe they would do it, but still, you're helping them do it for now. I mean, you're holding the ladder so the person can climb up to the window and break in or whatever. Maybe they do it whether you held the ladder or not, but still, it's a bad thing to be doing. And others say, could the person, not would they, but could they do it without you? Well, probably. I mean, most actions that we do, you could do it without the cooperation of someone else, or that person anyway, that person's help. So I don't think this works. So I have some criticisms there. And one of my major ones is that that the criteria involve, it's number 3 there, the criteria involve a continuum. So all those terms being used to define immediate, proximate, remote, are kind of vague in that directly and indirectly tends to produce an act. Well, you know, if you start off with the direct ones and then you kind of get eventually to the indirect ones, that forms a continuum. And it's very hard to know at what point you've tipped the balance and now you're doing indirect cooperation. Similarly, for being intimately bound up somehow with the agent's action. Well, some are more and less intimately bound up. So this makes it very difficult, it seems to me, to make the concept precise and therefore to apply it in any helpful way to considering the moral permissibility of actions. So my revised theory is to think instead about St. Thomas' analysis of human acts in terms of the 4 causes. I think I have to develop that a little bit briefly or the paper won't make any sense at all. So I'm going to go to that part. It's very brief because, as I said, now you're wondering why I wrote this paper since I don't know about any of these topics, okay? Or I'm not an expert on any of them. Well, I thought I was going to be getting to the 4th section and spending 75% of the paper on that part. But in order to get there and analyze this doctrine, it turned out to be much more complicated than I thought it was going to be. So I'm proposing a different theory of cooperation and evil. That brings in Aristotle's theory of causation of the 4 causes. Aristotle conceives of each thing as resulting from the operation of 4 causes: the formal cause, which determines a thing's nature; the material cause, which incarnates or receives that form; the efficient cause, which produces the thing; and the final cause, which is the end toward which the thing is directed. So the formal cause of an act would be the intention behind it. That tells us what kind of thing it is. That's how we define it, according to Thomas. So whatever the principal agent intends to do would be the form of the act, the agent's plan. I'm going to refer to it right now as the plan. Perhaps the plan's quite detailed, incorporating many subparts, or it might be fairly nebulous. In either case, the formal cause just coincides with the intention of the agent, however vague or specific it is. The material cause of an act consists of the bodily actions involved in performing it. And if it's a plan, though, not just a basic action, then material causes would include whatever objects or additional actions, instruments, and so forth are required to bring about the intended end. Thomas' discussion of the material causes of an act appears to include the agent's bodily movements and also the agent's other experiences or sensations, pleasure, thirst, and so forth, or conditions outside the agent that are part of the plan in some way. I was going to talk more about that, but I'll skip it. The primary efficient cause of the actualization of a power is the motive or motives that move the will to act. Immediately would be the will. All right, that actualizes the power to choose or to go towards an end. The will, of course, is moved by the motivations behind it, which will be good or bad ones. So this is where the motivation theory of virtue and vice comes in. And the final cause of the act is the plan is fully realized. The goal or end that the agent has in mind, as it would be is aiming for this actual thing. It's not here yet, but that's what drives, in a way, that's what you're aiming towards. So there's a sense in which the final cause is most central to the nature of the act because it characterizes the content, you might say, of the agent's intention. He says that's a remote cause. The intermediary acts, the means to the end, are proximate causes of the action. However, since both of them seem to involve, as we said before, the intention of the agent, contributions to those causes, right, the formal or the final cause, will be morally impermissible. They're very closely tied with the agent's evil intention. All right, so since the four causes of an act exhaust its ontological footprint, cooperation in an evil act can be defined as contributing something to one of the causal components. All right, so we have already talked about the first two. The material cause, as we have seen, is the constitutive parts, in a way, of the act or the plan. Whatever has to be done in order to fulfill the intention, arrive at the end that the person has in mind. Some of them are in the control of the agent, others require outside help. All right, I think that cooperating in evil, in the agent's evil plan, by providing one of its constituents, provides something essential to the plan. In other words, the plan cannot be realized without that particular contribution. It doesn't have to be by you, but you are providing something that is really integral. Because I think the intention that includes all of these subparts, or eventually it does, you find out you're going to need this, you're going to need a socket wrench or something like that, and you say, I have one, you bring it over, then that is to contribute to what belongs to the agent's intention of the means to the end and so forth, and you're aware of this. Maybe you don't intend it so much as a means, but you have an idea of what it's going to be used for and so on. So I think this implicates you in some way, maybe not as fully in the agent's evil act. Now this is where some people bring in the proportionality business. Well, you're contributing to it, but it's only a socket wrench. What if by doing that, okay, I'm trying hard to think of how great a good, results from this. Maybe it's a crappy one, an agent hurts their hand and can't do it, they can't follow through. Trigger finger is busted, I don't know. Okay, so that's a good thing, or some other good thing results. So people think often that you bring in the principle of double effect at this point. That's a confusion, right? Because principle of double effect has to do with your intention. It starts with your intention to bring about some good, and then you realize, you foresee, even though you don't intend it, that some relatively bad or unfortunate effects are also going to result from what you do. And then you weigh, the good that you intend to do or hope to do against the evil that your act is also likely to bring about. You don't intend it, but you could see that, but there's no part of your intention is to contribute in any way to the evil act. Your only intention is to bring about this good. The evil act isn't a means to that good. If it is, it's not double effect, and so forth. So double effect considerations don't come in here, even though many theologians bring them in at this point. Obviously contributing to the efficient cause is in fact in some way helping to actually produce. It's the normal kind of way we think about causes, I suppose, right? That brings the plan about, or some part of it about. And it's different from material causes, but not that different. So I believe that every kind of cooperation in evil, where this is defined as contributing to, assisting, causing, or furthering one of the four causes of that act, is always immoral. While this conflicts with the received view, I believe it remains in the spirit of that view, and that the revised view has several advantages over the traditional explication. I think those are also on your handout. Are they or not? A, distinguishing among various ways? Nope. Okay, so I'll run through them. Distinguishing among different ways of cooperating that refer to the same action or action plan. All right, so there's different ways of cooperating in the same act, all right, to one of the causes of that act or action plan. So it makes it a little clearer when you're contributing to something and when you're not, when you're maybe just what you do is a precondition of it, but it's not really contributing to that act, that evil intention and so forth. Secondly, enables us to justify the claim that cooperation in evil is always wrong. It always cooperates or contributes in some way to this evil act, to one of these causes that in fact constitute the act. It recognizes that some acts that cooperate in evil are more vicious than others, right? Depending on the extent to which you are helping the person. How many of these tools do you provide? Do you provide the weapons, the guns, and so forth? Hold the ladder, whatever it is. All right, and also it avoids concepts with fuzzy boundaries, the ones that I said form a continuum. All right, there are continua with respect to these causes, but at least the whole evaluation of the moral permissibility of the act doesn't hinge on those. So it's more a degree of responsibility for the evil act than whether or not your act is evil. And finally, it enables us to distinguish between acts that are related to evil acts in ways that are relevant to the doctrine of cooperation in evil, and acts that are not so related, that may be just, they're permissive in the sense really that they don't pertain in a way to that particular action. So you're delivering the mail, to the terrorist house, but you're just, as a part of the government and so forth, we deliver the mail to everybody. You do that, you're not, even if it makes the act possible in some way, all right, because somebody mails them, materials for making a bomb or something, it's not part of your intention, and even though it contributes something or other, it doesn't contribute to that particular action of the terrorist. All right, now, does God cooperate with evil? This turns out to be very short, okay? I think God does not cooperate with any of these four causes in the sense of contributing to them. The standard evaluation of evil acts is that they involve some kind of lack, some kind of distortion, deviation from God's will. So God certainly creates the people, sustains them, their actions and so forth as beings, but does not intend the evil. Jacques Maritain, who was trying to sort of sort this out, he's a Thomist, yet here's God's action directing you like an arrow to the good, right? You choose the good, and God's aiming your will at the good, but then you kind of swerve it. Okay, your will sort of swerves it away, so it starts to go off from that nice trajectory. But that's confusing because it's like Epicurean swerve. I mean, what causes the swerve? Right? If it's something you cause, then you're exercising your power, bringing about, maybe not a real entity or whatever, but you're causing, the right orientation of it to go off track. And if you don't intend it, then how can you be responsible for it? And if God doesn't intend it, maybe it doesn't have a cause. So you have these Humean issues, right? Pops into being. How could I be responsible for it? How could it be an act of my will, and so on? So I don't think that helps. And I wrote a paper on this a couple years ago, in fact, what it means to, what the agent contributes to acting and what God contributes to acting. My conclusion was it can't be solved. All right, which is too bad because it seems like a philosophical question, not just a theological one, or maybe not even a theological question. But I think I might have to put it in the category of mysteries of faith or something. I could not figure out a way that was sort of satisfactory, whether you talk about counterfactuals of freedom, whether you talk about coordination, like God's the primary cause and you're the secondary cause. God causes this, but in a voluntary way. Causes your actions, but in a voluntary way, you're a voluntary agent. And you go, well, if God's causing them to go this certain way, then I don't feel like I'm in control, right? So maybe it's a compatibilist view, which I would reject. It's not really capturing the view that we are self-determining, right? Like Aquinas seems to say. So I believe God obviously permits vicious acts, but does not in any way intend them or cooperate with them. All right, permits them only. And that's it. Thank you very much.
So we'll now have some brief comments by Mr.
Thanks very much, Laura. Sure. Laura presents a very comprehensive account of actions that cooperate with evil in order to, following Jacques Maritain, better understand the relationship between divine and human causal contributions, and specifically morally wrong actions. She maintains that unless God's causal contribution to an evil act somehow assists an agent in the viciousness of her intention or subsequent actions, God is not responsible for the vicious actions of the agent. She also rejects the claim that, quote, to cause or permit vicious acts is to contribute in some way to their occurring, end quote. So presumably God could permit vicious acts without contributing to their occurring. If that's the case, then even if Laura's analysis did save God from contributing to evil, the fact that moral condemnation can still come from just permitting evil seems to have left us with the standard problem of evil. Accordingly, we still want to know how the permission of the horrendous evils we find in the world is compatible with the existence of God.
All right, sure, you wanted me to solve the problem of evil. Okay, no problem. All right, I didn't even have enough time to do this part. All right, so, give me a break here. No, it's true, I did not solve the problem. I didn't say much of anything about why God permits, or what might be a reason for God to permit, morally vicious actions, even horrendous evils, and so forth. If I address that question, I think I would not appeal to things that make God's permitting of it just logically possible, say, even though that's not intended to be a theodicy. Plantinga's view that maybe God can't create. It's impossible, logically impossible for God to create a world. It could be logically impossible for God to create a world with free moral agents who none of them ever, they never fall, as it were. No, it's sinless. Maybe because the agent's acts are up to him or her, just so turns out that because of transworld depravity exists, which is not a causal factor, just a kind of way of naming that view. And in fact, I don't think it would be a better world without vicious actions, without leaving people free. Not just the freedom about it is good, that we have free agents, but even the fact that we are allowed to choose between virtue and vice. I think that's a good too. I think it actually contributes to goods of a greater kind than even in a world where agents are not allowed to, or just happen never to perform anything vicious and so forth. For two reasons. I think the combination of, Steve's view about our ignorance vis-a-vis God on what kind of goods and so forth might be achieved by this, about what kind of connections there are between the evils we experience and some other goods and so on. Just because we don't see those connections or the goods, we don't experience them, at least in this life, that we can judge, therefore, that God doesn't have any such reasons. And William Alston has an essay, some temporarily final thoughts on the inductive argument from evil, where he says more or less the same thing, only develops it at great length. And I think that that's true. That's not a positive theodicy so much as a kind of negative one. But I think Marilyn Adams was on the right track at least some of the time, to bring in Christian, even Catholic doctrines of the value of suffering. All right, the value of Christ's suffering, the value of participating in it, the value of accepting your participation in it freely. Let it be done to me. And because of the goods that are brought about by it, maybe for yourself, but mainly for others. So it involves this deep kind of gift of yourself, or giving yourself away, or denial, that paradoxically actually fulfills you as a person. Is the best way to your own self-fulfillment. So that's a little bit paradoxical, but that is the Christian view, I take it. And participating in things like that is not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, the horrendous evils are difficult to explain for us, but then we don't know the end of the story, at least in my view. So if I was going to try a positive thing, I think I would bring in some doctrinal things like that from Revelation, rather than trying to do it by purely philosophical considerations like soul making or what have you. All right, so that's the direction I would go in, but I didn't do that here.
So when I take questions, and Jim asked me Is there an undergraduate representative from the Rover here that wants to ask the first question?
No,
No.
it isn't from the Rover. The
Oh,
Rover
sorry.
kind of arm twisted me into putting the requirement in that undergraduate, we favor undergraduates on that. So I said, well, I'll make, if there's an undergraduate, I don't think we have
There aren't any undergraduates here.
It's just as well, all right? Even the professors were a little bit bored with this, so, you know.
All right, the floor's open. Justin, why don't you start? Keep your hand up. I'll acknowledge you and make a speaker's list.
Yeah. Okay. So, I guess philosophy questions are often objections, just with question
That's
marks.
fine, yes, of
But
course.
this is like a real question. 'Cause
Okay,
I don't know.
all right.
So this is just like, what do you think about this? 'Cause
Okay.
I don't know a lot about Catholic moral theology or the Catholic metaphysical tradition or anything. But it seems like you just sort of take for granted in the paper that God is like morally evaluable, that if a certain sort of cooperation in evil would be impermissible for us, then it would be impermissible for God. And it seems like, at least if you're working out of sort of like the majority report of the Catholic metaphysical and virtue ethics traditions, then there might be some sort of prima facie problem there, because the reason that like a certain sort of, or if the reason that a certain sort of material cooperation is supposed to be bad is, well, it's not what a virtuous person would do.
Mm-hmm.
And if virtues are supposed to be the things that like contribute or constitute you recognizing your telos, and if God, I assume, doesn't have a telos because he doesn't have a form.
He's his own too.
Maybe that's the answer.
Yeah. No, go ahead, keep going.
Yeah. Like how are we supposed to understand virtue talk as applied to God?
That's a
I
good
guess is my
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually hadn't thought of that question myself. What I think I would want to say is that the main virtue that underlies the others is this virtue of love, concern for others. And so God exemplifies that, in my view, by necessity, right? And is the kind of, to the extent that we know anything about God, right, is the paradigm, and we're trying to imitate that by trying to acquire more virtues, for which Aquinas thinks we need the virtue of faith, hope, and love, which are infused in us by grace, all right? We don't work our way up to this kind of selfless love. It's very difficult. I mean, people can act, obviously, out of those motives and acquire virtues and grow in virtue. A lot of my friends that don't have faith are way more virtuous than I am. It makes it hard to kind of convert them and everything, but but anyway, in the case for God, some people think he can't be evaluated morally at all because God is the source of moral obligation and isn't subject to those kinds of evaluation. I disagree with that view, but it's been defended. Robert Adams defended a version of that for a while. I think these terms can apply to God, but yeah, God can't grow in the virtues, but exemplifies things like justice. Some of the virtues would require, many of them, a kind of control over your appetites, desire, sort of bodily, the result of being embodied. And God wouldn't, those kind of virtues wouldn't apply to God. So yeah, growing in virtue wouldn't. But I guess I would like to think that this fundamental one does apply to God, that love and concern. In fact, Aquinas says it's impossible for God not to will the good of anything that he's made. It would be contradictory somehow. You create something, you will it as a good, and that God can't take that back. Both will its good and then not. So all the things that exist, but especially humans, it would be impossible for him not to have that attitude toward us.
Sort of a favorite, like, meta-ethical story about what grounds certain characteristics being virtues for God? Is it that he's his own telos?
Probably that would just come from God's being the, I want to say the first cause. I like the cosmological argument. So in the case of God, like to say God has every perfection, therefore, but Aquinas tries to develop this, in the Summa, out of previous things he arrives at. I mean, it's architectonic, right? If you say this, then it follows that such and such. I don't know how all of that works or whether it works. Kind of sympathetic to it, but I would not want to take on defending it myself, I guess. With respect to human beings, I would. I think you need ultimately a metaphysical story. Why are we the kind of being for whom, gift of self or something like love in this sense, benevolence, also doesn't just help others, but it helps us. That contributes to our own, real happiness, joy, peace, whatever, that trying to serve ourselves, at the end what we get is ourselves. And it's not that great, okay, we find. That's not that satisfying. Relationships with others, I think loving relationships with others are in fact what makes our life worth living, or what we think is the goal in a way. And especially, I suppose, a loving relationships with God, if there is a God. So yeah, I think you have to figure out why that's true of beings with our nature, mainly that we're persons, I'd want to say. John Paul II also sort of goes that direction a bit, but often he stops the philosophy and turns to scripture at a certain point and backs things up with that. The realist phenomenology tradition, phenomenological realism, developed in part by Max Scheler, Edith Stein, and others, right? And contemporarily too, right? Their offspring, in a way, their philosophical children and grandchildren continue to work that out. I think it probably has to be supplemented with some kind of view of substances, right, along the line of Aristotle as well. I don't know if it can stand by itself, drawing on phenomenology and the like. So that's a little complicated, but Jorge, who's my husband, as you might surmise, and works out this theory of virtue ethics that I'm attracted to, kind of floats free of that, or it doesn't try to ground it particularly in a metaphysical view, starts from things that we all, kind of ordinary language philosophy in a way, that we all tend to agree on, that, facts about our assumptions, our desires, how other people feel toward us, that kind of thing. But yeah, I work in metaphysics, so I think you need an ontological basis eventually.
Yes, sir.
So I was going to say what Jim said basically about the hardest cases are the ones that involve permitting evil, at least on your view,
Right.
without cooperating on it. And so in a way, you might be right about criticizing this argument, but there's another one that sort of focuses on those kinds of cases. But and then also just about the Marilyn Adams approach, I was thinking, well, it's one thing for the value of suffering for people who are adults, but the hardest cases, again, are ones where children suffer and die, and they never really get a chance to have whatever advantage suffering might bring. Those are aside, but I wondered what you thought about whether you would say there's cooperation. It's more directly to your claims about cooperation or not. So that case about the little girl in Flint, and so the...
Well, I don't know that case that well. Maybe
I'll describe
you could catch me up on that.
So there was a woman and her boyfriend and the roommate, and they all went to a bar on New Year's Eve, and they got drunk, and the bartender kicked the boyfriend out, and he went home, and she stayed with the roomer for a while at the bar, came home later. They got into an argument with each other. She actually hit him and knocked him out, and went up to bed.
Not bad.
And then the little girl, her daughter, came downstairs to go to the bathroom later in the night, and he then, at least probably he, raped, beat, and strangled the little girl to death. And the mom, was upstairs, could have, if she'd known about it, would have intervened again. And,
Right.
I mean, actually, he got off, this is an aside, that he got off in trial because the lawyer cast doubt on whether it was him or the roommate,
Wow.
or the roomer. Well, in any case, so imagine a slightly different scenario where she knew that this boyfriend would probably do that sort of thing, and she didn't take any precautions to make sure that the little girl slept with her or locked her bedroom or something like that. Would you say that in that kind of case she was cooperating, but it seems like a case of permission and cooperation?
Yeah, I think both in this case. In other words, I think you can cooperate by not acting in a way to prevent something that you see would be somebody's either evil act or, intention for an evil act. If you're aware that as you say, that they will or might likely do something like that, then you contribute by failing to do anything about that. All right, it seems to me. So that is a contribution, even though it's, you might say, not a...
There's no intention, say, or do you think,
Yeah,
are you going to say
I think it's a bad intention in that even though it's not an intention to act, I think an intention not to act or not to pay attention or not to attend to it or whatever can also be vicious. and a vicious contribution because of, I mean, vicious in itself. I mean, not paying attention to your daughter and harms in general, you know, that might attend to your kids, that's also vicious. And you don't, obviously, if there's somebody takes advantage of them, that act he's responsible for. However, to the extent that you permitted it, not just by your ignorance or something like that, which wouldn't necessarily implicate you, but by not taking enough care of your kids, right? Not doing what you should. Yeah, I would say that is a contribution to it.
This is follow-up. Are you going to say, Laura, that every negligent act is going to involve intention?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, you can be responsible for your negligence or not responsible for it, it seems to me. But if your negligence on a scale of viciousness is sort of on the lighter end of it, maybe, depends what you were in this role or whatever towards the other person, what your responsibilities are towards them. To your kids, it's pretty stringent, it seems to be. So being negligent about something that's really important to their well-being is wrong, right? Involves you in a wrong thing. However, and it is itself wrong, right? Let's just say that's an evil on your part, all right? Whether or not it ends up that any harm actually comes to the child, all right? If you let them run around in the street, what you do is wrong, all right? Even though it's not you're not doing something, you're failing to do something, but that's wrong too. Negligence in the case of some, you could say, well, the person didn't, you forgot to put your seatbelt on, or you forgot to put their seatbelt on, or whatever. Are you morally responsible then for the fact they got hurt in the accident? Well, some cases like that are just a human failure, not really deliberate, or not just, I don't care, I'm not going to bother, or whatever. So there's different ways of being negligent. So that would be kind of a hard one. I think you have to go case by case. By the way, with the traditional doctrine, you sympathize with this. One of the earliest people to kind of spell it out was 1945. I believe Henry Davis, a theologian who's been very active since then too, says, well, when we come to applying these principles, he says, there's lots of varieties of opinion. He says, that makes it probably the hardest problem in all of moral theology. So when I got to that point, believe me, I wished I could opt out of the entire project. But it was too far gone. I had to carry on. But yeah, that kind of was a little daunting. Like, why on earth would I decide to write on this? I mean, I had in the back of my mind the HHS cases and stuff, but I never got that far of the applications.
Our next question is from Evan.
Okay.
Yeah, a brief comment and then a question which is actually very similar to Bruce's. Mm-hmm. I do have some worries about your theory of action, and one that I just wonder about briefly. It's a theory that seems to suggest that our intentions are always under our control. I'm not sure how much it matters for your theory whether that's true or not, but it does seem to me plausible to say that there are certain actions that I perform intentionally, but where the formation of that intention is actually not under my control. So,
Right.
I'm rock climbing, and I'm kind of...
You're not a rock climber too.
Yeah.
With Flanagan, okay. The philosophical world is filled with rock climbers.
So where philosophy's done.
He took me one time. Okay, I was not cut out for it, it turns out. Okay, go ahead.
So you're up there on the sharp end and you start to peel.
Uh-huh.
And there is a good hold.
Uh-huh.
And you go for it. And you go for it intentionally.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But I mean, I don't think that's a case where I want to say that, that forming that intention was under my voluntary control. Right?
Well, okay.
If you're a trained climber, you don't have to think about this, right?
Right. Well, I think there are a lot of actions like that where you don't have to think about them, that you just, but I think if you're a trained climber with that, I mean, it might be a case where clients would say, kind of choice of the means and intention are one and the same. I mean, you've got kind of one means here. You've got the one good hold. If you don't grab it right away, you're going to die. So, you go for that one. And, you don't have to deliberate long or whatever. But, somewhere, as a climber, somewhere in the back of your mind has to be, this is a good hold over here, because I didn't know stuff like that, right, as a non-rock climber. I would say, that's not a hold, that's some bitty little, how's that, how's that going to do anything? Yeah, see it over there? Well, you got to let go of this one if you're going to get that one, so no way. Okay, that kind of stuff, right? But as a climber, you pick this, right, for a reason of some kind, even if you're not thinking deliberately about it.
There's a reason in a way, but I'm not sure that forming the intention
is itself. It might not be. You might be coerced by terrifying thought that you might fall off the cliff or something.
Yeah.
And in those cases, Aquinas does say that sometimes our intentions aren't really our own in a way. They're not free. Because either in a situation like that, or fear, or desires of some kind, or other things just overwhelm your will in some way. Now, say you're an addict, for example. Okay, that seems to be a clear case where somebody offers you, a hit of crack, or now it's heroin because it's cheap, and it's becoming this huge epidemic. Okay, so kids, this girl, in fact, they interviewed, said that even if that they're mixing it with stuff and it kills people, so people have died. She knows people have died from this particular brand. She says, it just makes you all the more interested in trying it because, wow, that must be great stuff, man. That must be creme de la creme. You even killed someone, right? Which seems like the most bizarre motivation you could possibly imagine. But I assume that maybe earlier intentions of hers might have been free in some way, but that one probably isn't. So in that case, you would say, I don't think it's it's not an intention in an intentional sense, in a way, in a strong sense. It's an act it's a plan to do something, right? Take this heroin and use it, but it's not particularly a free intention. So basically, I agree with what you're saying.
So here's the other, if I may, the other question. It's kind of like the girl in the Flint case. I'm an instructor at a shooting range. And I got this guy who's taking lessons from me, and at some point I get onto the sense that he's planning a murder. He's training
for that
murder, right? Now, it does, it seems straightforwardly true, doesn't it, that if I continue just to give him the lessons that we contracted for and so on.
What seems true about that? If you do that, then you're cooperating and evil,
yeah,
or that, okay?
That I share
right.
You
share some responsibility, yeah.
Right. And of course, there are various things that I might do at that point that would remove that sort of responsibility.
Just teach him how to shoot crooked or something.
Right.
Yes, sorry, yeah.
Or talk to the police about watching.
Yeah, right.
Who knows
right.
what would be the best thing to do. So I wonder about the case of God. Especially if you think that he's got a foreknowledge. He's got it looks like a dilemma with respect to, take this guy who's, maybe I don't figure out that he's going to commit a murder. God knows that he's going to commit a murder, right? Does God do something that in effect short circuits his ability to make that choice? In other words, abrogates his freedom?
I don't think so, because I don't think that God is cooperating or contributing the way that you are there to an evil act, because what God wills is that
sustains this guy
right
in a state of healthy living.
Right, which is good.
There are a lot of things
good.
that God could do to.
Of course, God could do, but chooses not to. But I think that's more of a case with God's intentions, you might say, are closer to a case of double effect in a way. So there's a good that God has in mind. And I don't think it's like double effect in this sense that, okay, so you have these side effects. God could prevent those from occurring, it's true. The side effects being the evil actions that people do because of their freedom and so forth, the suffering. Should that be permitted by a perfectly good being? Well, I think we don't really know enough to know that. So I'm with Alston on that point, because we don't know all the goods that there are that God might have in mind right? We can't even imagine some of them maybe, what kind of goods might eventually anyway, not in this life. I think, Bruce, you're right about that. Little children, their suffering, I think it's also included in the suffering of Christ, but they can't choose that in this life, okay? So maybe it turns out that, when they are in the next life, when they arrive in heaven or whatever, then they have this opportunity at least to look back and say, am I in some ways weirdly grateful that I got to have this opportunity, to share, to have my own part in it, something like that. And maybe not. I mean, maybe that's just hard for us to envisage, but not impossible maybe to envisage something along those lines, it seems to me. So, I mean, what Olson says, and also connections between the sufferings of this life, therefore, all of them, even the most horrendous ones, and the connections between those and whatever goods there are. We also don't know what those might be.
I'm going to let Laura get
Right.
the last word. Are you done?
But,
Oh,
okay.
just on this question, we still have 3 people on the list. So.
Okay, yes. So, so I don't think it involves God in directly contributing to evil, helping evil along, but God does permit it. And so that's the project of theodicy, right, to try to figure out why would God permit such a thing. I don't think we're going to find out, I guess, in this life. You can think of as many possibilities as, even this one that I sort of favor. Well, how does that help, really, in a way? Like, why have any suffering, you might say? Christ's suffering too, isn't that just another case or something? So that wouldn't even be necessary if people didn't sin, and on you could go, right? So how is it going to contribute in some way to a good that is so great, so important, or so, even for us, you might say, even for people that have suffered, that they feel privileged to have been in some way a part of it. That's what I think, in a way, is how it's going to be in the end, even though, so if that were true, I guess that would be a reason. But in theodicy, it seems you never know whether that is the reason God has, or it's anywhere close to it, just because of the problems of our own inability to figure out, what that would be like, or to understand it in the sense of we don't experience it now. So what would that be like, and would it be sufficient or not? I don't think we know really. But I think your case is correct, that you shouldn't continue to keep instructing the guy. And I think you don't have to do all the good that you can do, even though you shouldn't cooperate in evil. So you could do more good, perhaps, by contacting the police. I'm not sure you're always obliged to do things like that, but maybe you are. That's sort of the tough call for me. Things that are a little bit more removed, like if I don't, am I being negligent if I don't let the police know? Should I have done that? And then if I don't, am I partially implicated in whatever he does? Should I, do something more to try to prevent him or something? So pretty soon you get to things that you don't really have to do. Maybe they'd be heroic in some way, but you're not required to do them.
So you moved very quickly at the end there.
I'm sorry about that. Jim was adamant about that.
Yeah.
You're done. Okay.
I'm worried about why God doesn't contribute to the material cause.
Mm-hmm.
So when you defined the material cause, you said it was the bodily actions performed and also the external conditions.
Right.
So I could see that God wouldn't contribute to those if you said that to be material cause they had to be qua means.
Mm-hmm.
But that would be the formal, it would
Right.
seem to me. So you
Right.
you wouldn't have that avenue of escape. So why doesn't God contribute to the material cause?
Because in a way, I think all the material causes are, as it were, already in place. So there, God doesn't intend to add something here. Like now the person needs such and such. God doesn't create that out of nothing and just make sure the person has it and so forth. So although God sustains everything in being, all the material causes, as it were, sustains them in being, I don't think that's a contribution in this case to the evil of the person. The situation between God and ourselves isn't wholly analogous or whatever. It's not wholly analogous because God has already created us and so forth and given us the power to do evil things. So you might say, well, that's a precondition of being able to do them. And there being things around we can use is also a precondition of being able to use them badly and viciously and so forth. But God is not putting those things in place knowing that they're going to be as a sort of part of your plan and knowing they're going to be part of your evil plan and so forth. It's not why they're created. All right. So even though pretty much everything that exists is, you could say that that's part of God's intention and allows bad things to happen. I guess I don't think it's that analogous to ourselves making a contribution to the person's actions because, God creates them in the first place. They depend on him. If we help out, we're knowing the person's intention and everything, we're sort of contributing to the person's evil intention in some way. We're not just contributing something that has nothing to do with that, and we don't even know that it has to do with it. So while Evan's giving the first lessons to this guy, doesn't know about these intentions and so forth, so that wouldn't be cooperating in evil. But once he finds out, his job, we do what we're supposed to do. All right? God can permit things, in other words, that we're not allowed to just say, well, God's permitted, and I'm not going to bother. I mean, some people have had that view, I think, that these things are going to happen anyway, and God just lets them go by, so why should I get myself involved in it? I think that's not okay for us. So we don't know God's reasons for permitting people to do these things, but I think what he has created in a way is no part of an intention, even material cooperating somehow in the evil that we do. It makes it possible, you might say.
I think you there depart from an Aristotelian notion of matter. And you're perfectly at liberty to do that. But for Aristotle, the matter is not something new.
Well, it isn't,
The
right.
matter is already there. And it is a potential that's then actualized. So
It's a potential.
If God gives us what's already there.
And he gives us the power to actualize and so forth, the power of the will, power to intend, but he does not thereby contribute to the way we decide, what we decide to do with it, right? The viciousness, you might say, that we intend something, we come to intend something and carry out something that's wrong, right?
So that he doesn't give us the form, but he does.
Yeah, but he doesn't. I don't think he gives us the material cause of that act in the sense of, well, because I'm thinking of the material cause of the act here as because for the human case, you can't provide the person's intentions. You can't provide their basic actions and so forth. But you can provide other things that helps them achieve their end. And you have to be sort of aware of that and provide them anyway, even though you don't totally intend that they use them this way. Like Evan says, I'd be responsible, even though I don't want the guy to murder someone. That's not part of my intention. But by sort of supplying the person in a way with skills or with instruments or ingredients involved in that plan, then I'm implicated in it. I guess I do think let me just concede this, that's the hardest case. I think that's the hardest case. So basically, John, I'm winging it here. I came up with this theory not that long ago. I just didn't like the other one, and I thought, well, how should you? The other one's horrible. So how should you think about this? So I mostly focused, I have to say, on the human cases, and then I'm trying to apply that to the divine act of creating and of permitting us to be free, and therefore permitting us to do things that are vicious and so forth. So is God in some way you might say, yeah, in some way, that's a condition of some kind, right, for the vicious acts. So that's probably why some people want to say, you're right, it's probably a Thomistic thing. That's why every theologian I read, operating out of that tradition, will say some things you do and they some way cooperate aren't really morally blameworthy or they're not impermissible. And then they tend to bring in the doctrine of double effect in order to explain that. I don't think that really works. So I'm not sure how that story goes. I guess I won't let God off the hook, but I'm not sure that's true for human beings. So maybe you just can't work it out. You can't apply it directly to God. I'm not sure what to say there. In other words, it's a good question. I have to think about it some more.
So Adrian was next on the list, but I think he's left. So Jim, and now the
Gave
list
up.
is open after Jim, so if people have questions or
Yeah,
follow-ups.
my question, I had a question in the beginning, but now I've changed a little bit. So one way you're presenting this is very interesting, is there's sort of background conditions, and God provides the background conditions, and so that way he's not so much implicated in the evil. Actually, he's not doing something new. But there's a way to think about that he is, or not, or that there's an action component here that is new. What God is doing is he's not preventing the evil consequences.
That's right.
Think about the state. Imagine a state that just sort of sat back with respect to murders, assaults, whatever else. Says, well, let's just let people be free and work out their virtue. We said, no, you can't do that. Your state's got to be proactive here. It's got to get involved, and it's got to try to prevent these things. And it's wrong if it doesn't. And so there's a whole sense of what you can look at God not being interventionist enough is the problem. So. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I guess, in general out there, I would say that God is in a different position with respect to murder and so on than we are. That it is our job to try to prevent murders, to certainly not to contribute to them and so forth. That is what we're called to do, and what the state is called to do and so forth. Otherwise, we're falling down in our own moral obligations, and we should try to grow in our concern for other people, which means we would try as hard as we can, right, to prevent harm to them and so forth. So I do think that's what we're required to do. God is in a somewhat different, it's not that there are no moral, well, I wouldn't say constraints particularly, there's no moral implications, as it were, of being perfectly good. I think there are. But God might have ends in mind in other words, I think it's more a case of, well, why create these creatures and then not intervene all the time and prevent their vicious actions? Even though he asks us to do that. I think God must have something else in mind then. What good could be brought about by permitting people to do that? That there might actually be a good of a very significant kind that is connected to, not to people's vicious actions so much, but to permitting people to act viciously and permitting people apparently to suffer as a result, permitting suffering, permitting pain, permitting disappointments and so forth in our lives. And even if we don't really have a good idea of what it is, God would be in a different position, therefore, we can't turn murders into something great ourselves, right? So some cases of double effect, you could say, well, I'm permitted to do something that I see will have some bad effects as long as I intend this, that's the good effect. The bad effect isn't a means to it. I mean, there's all these criteria, right? A double effect. And therefore, I am personally, as an agent, maybe not morally responsible for everything that results from my actions. But like you say, God has infinite knowledge, knows it all, knows what's going to be the fallout and so forth, and doesn't prevent it. So so then you have two options. Either there's no God, or there is a God, and therefore this perfectly good being. God has some way of turning these things to a very great good.
So God can do evil, but good may come of it.
He's not doing evil. He's permitting evil. He's not doing evil.
But at a certain level, take human context.
Yeah.
In a context where the evil at stake is really significant, not permitting it becomes a doing. It's
That's
just
right.
Just as bad as
right. Well, it does contribute to it, but I think in God's case, he is not contributing to the evil acts. He's permitting them. Nothing he does contributes to whatever it is that's our part in choosing evil or good. He doesn't determine that part of it. So I don't think he's causing evil in some sense.
Yeah.
You say he's permitting the evil, but why wouldn't you be obligated to intervene when you see some horrible suffering, especially to little children, is going to result? We would feel the obligation to do that, and I think we have the obligation to do that.
Right.
So I am suggesting not that God has no obligation, he doesn't have to care about suffering. I think he does.
Yeah.
I think participating in our suffering in a very deep way, that is, not just being with us in it, but almost being us, right? Taking it also on himself and thereby sort of overcoming it in some way, or I don't want to know, atoning for things, making mercy and love possible even. That in the end, God can be merciful even to a murderer, even though it's not our job to say, well, you know, it must be hard for you. You're pretty peeved at this person, so whatever. We can't do that. But, you know, in the end, God can offer forgiveness. And that, you know, like the people in the gospel say, only God can forgive sins, so why are you saying this? Your sins are forgiven. There are just things that God is able to do that we're not able to do. And so I don't think it's a parallel set, I guess, of obligations. I mean, we permit our kids to suffer a little bit. A little, not like that, obviously. If we did, we'd be morally culpable. But we do permit some degree of suffering because they have to learn some things, right? They have to learn that if you do that to another person, that look at how you've hurt them, you know, with what you said or did or whatever. So we got to avoid that one.
I would think that you could do the same thing for God, because God could let us suffer a bit, you know.
Well, that's because we're analyzing, I don't know how to say that. Anyway, we're comparing ourselves, God's situation to ours. And I just think that's not, it's not required of a theist to think that God is exactly the same situation that we are, and therefore that God ought to prevent these if we ought to prevent them. I agree that it would be easier if God did, the problem of evil wouldn't be such a problem, obviously, if we could see that, if we saw that all of these ways of suffering weren't that bad, and in fact they contributed to our growth and virtue and whatnot, then there wouldn't be a problem of evil, it seems to me, or not a very serious one. But we can't, I mean, one of the things Swinburne said that I always liked was that if you're not permitted to do evils, if you're not permitted to withhold love or to do something bad, then nothing you do makes very much difference to anybody else's life. In other words, by refraining from doing that, you know, I can't help that because just God's going to make sure I can't hurt you. So whether I'm a good mother or a bad mother, right, or a good friend or a bad friend, it's not really going to hurt you that much either way. So I don't have this kind of deep impact on other people's lives if I can't, in principle, do something, right, neglect that role, and that will really be harmful for them. On the other hand, I can do wonderful goods for them because they do depend, we depend on each other. And even as a professor, I think we feel that, right? If we don't prepare, if we don't care about the students, where they're at, we just kind of carry on regardless. They're not getting anything. They all get D-minuses because they didn't get it. You know, that's not doing our job. So we have to be concerned. And it matters whether we are or we aren't.
So we have 9 minutes left and 3 people on the queue, so we'll start.
I'll try to be shorter.
No, that's all right. We'll start curtailing the follow-up, so you get 1 follow-up.
Okay.
So Carl, you're next.
Okay, sure. I just want to say I really appreciated the talk in this first handout and all these complexities, all the good stuff. I don't know how you deal with evil, but we're trying to figure out what it would be to be good, or what good there might be in case that might help with the evil problem. Mm-hmm. So I like the MVT and the Magi, and this thought of I intend that we A, or we do A, or whatever. That seems to be very important. It seems to link a lot with John's talk yesterday and Kant's project, because Kant's got this weird thing in religion,
Yes.
where he says we're trying to build a commonwealth, also somehow with God in some sense. So somehow we're all trying to make sense of this.
You have the nicest interpretation of Kant there I've ever heard. I have
Yeah,
to
very
say,
nice
the
guy.
two of you really bail him out. I don't know if he deserves you, but anyway.
Here's the trouble. Wondering
Yeah,
on
yeah.
your MBT and your question yesterday about love. The way this theory is laid out, it seems to be very act-centered. It's virtue-based, rule-centered, and it's then spelled out in terms of proper attitude towards a person. But I wondered, wouldn't the theory also be such that it could be spelled out in terms of character and disposition, so that it's not just a matter of...
No, it is, yeah. I didn't, say that much about that, but you could say a virtuous person is somebody who habitually acts out of motives of kindness, benevolence, and so forth, as a matter of, it's expected because this is how they do enough, in a way, Aristotelian, they do enough virtuous actions, or they operate out of those motives.
Yeah, and then the
more and more.
and then you said you didn't want the comp theory because there wasn't enough love in it, but I was looking at this list of all these proper attitudes. The approving, appreciating, the admiring, and it just seems like somebody's asking too much of us there. So wouldn't it be better to just say, I want to have a good character and I want to have respectful concern or benevolence for everybody, but I just can't admire some people, even those people I want to help the most who are just...
Well, you don't admire everybody
Okay.
on this view. Admiring is just one of these attitudes. So if somebody acts, I mean, in other words, our concern, we're interested in how other people turn out. If they do something really great, then we should appreciate that and admire it and so forth. We shouldn't just like, oh, wow, ho-hum. Just like when they do something vicious to others, we should care about that. But I agree. I mean, actually, I read it much more as involving these affective attitudes much more than Jorge does. He's kind of a Kantian. Wishing others well is just, may you flourish. The end. It's a kind of fact. Fact is, if you flourish, I'm for that. You know, in some sense of for. If you don't, that's too bad. You know, that's, I disapprove of A, you know. But it doesn't have the kind of, you know, more like depth, even though there's deserative, affective, and so forth involved, right? Go ahead.
Well, if you just put together the shared intention, I mean, so if
Yeah,
I wish you
yeah,
well,
that's right.
and I have intention with you together to, you know, I mean, so I meet, I don't know.
To do the good, you're
Hitler's
saying.
brother or something.
That's really nice. I like that. I hadn't thought about that at all. That's nice.
Okay.
Thank you. Steve?
I thought the role of roles was significant, and I'm kind of thinking that it could be useful in these type of cases that Jim has been pestering us with this year, the Superman type cases, where we imagine some superhero with much greater powers than ours, and it would be wrong for him to just allow something to happen, like somebody to lob a missile at my head, and Bruce, Super Bruce, there, not like with his long tongue snatching it out of the air.
Well,
I'm thinking of X.
Can he be
X-Men,
faster than a
some of
bullet?
the X,
You know,
I think
faster
the
than the
X-woman
bullet?
has a tongue like that.
Yeah.
Kind of like a,
Superman was really fast.
he was. He didn't know all his powers either. He discovered
That's
new
right,
ones.
bit by bit.
He could walk through walls.
Incredible.
He did by aligning the atoms with the spaces between the atoms and the walls. Anyway,
Scientifically sophisticated view.
yes, matter is mostly empty space.
Yeah.
She's distracting me. Can you?
Sorry, I'm sorry. All right. The Superman roles. You're talking about roles. Roles. Okay, sorry.
So, keeping a very scaled down version, I was thinking you might have in certain, like West Point and other places, you have an honor code among the students where they're supposed to report each other if they catch each other cheating. And let's suppose that's a good thing to be in a school where they have that type of responsibility. And yet, and they might think, well, then there's a moral principle, one ought to do this. And it is a moral principle relative to their role, but you might say the school, I'm looking at that little, is that a camera on the wall there? The school could have little, it could have the capacity to monitor their behavior.
Right.
And catch them cheating, but the headmaster and the people say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to allow them to cheat when they are able to get away with it. Create a context where they can. They might not be the rule governing the students' honor code might be quite different than the role that they have as the constructors and runners of the school. And that seems very plausible in those type of cases. I'm not saying it gives an easy solution to the red is evil ones, but nevertheless, it's a sort of relevant thing to bring in into the analysis of those cases.
Yeah.
So I want to really draw on your.
Oh, thank you.
Was that part of?
That's part of Jorge's theory, frankly. You should read him. He spent a lot of time trying to develop which roles are morally significant. I mean, it's a little vague, obviously. It's hard to make this as tight as you might like. Which roles are morally significant ones? And then trying to figure out, so what is required of me in various roles. But I take it the instructors or whatever, the administrators, have a certain goal in mind that they, even in a regular school, I'm not sure you're obliged to report everyone who's cheating. Maybe you are when you observe this. But there, it's like we are one in a way. They're trying to bring about a kind of unity, a camaraderie. We are, everything one does influences everything the other one does. You cannot cheat your way because this might in the end mean that you let me down when you should know about something and you don't, and so on. So there's a kind of, they want them to sense this interdependence, I think, and the importance of helping each other out, not letting people just have a pass and stuff like that. So maybe that ratchets up their obligation, but it also might be a good reason for the administrators not to intervene, even if they know the person cheated, in order to kind of, because if they do, then all the students know I don't have to report the person, they'll be found out anyway. And that just totally undermines the end they're trying to accomplish. So that, yeah, that's, I think, an interesting suggestion. So both you and Carlos are talking about positive ways you might use these theories with respect to good and virtuous actions, which is, that's really helpful, I think. Thanks.
Bruce, do you want our final question?
I just wanted to summarize the kind of discussion that Evan and I were beginning, and the reason I asked you about the woman with a modified version, she knows that the boyfriend's going to probably, and I thought, I wanted to get your answer. Did you think that she would then be cooperating? You said yes. And then I forgot to make the point that I was really going to make, was because I was going to make one that's similar to Evan made, namely that I thought the theory was then the reason she cooperated was because she knew about it and could have prevented it, and she didn't, and so she was cooperating. But then, of course, if that's sufficient, then you would apply that same theory to God. He knew about this, he could have prevented it, and he didn't, so he cooperated. But I think, and now this is the part I'm not quite sure, Laura, you tell me, but I think you then add and say that's not really sufficient, those two conditions. You also have to take into account whether these things were merely foreseen or somehow there was some more involvement than merely foreseen. And so that's how you're, are you, this is a question, distinguishing the modified mom's case that I described and what I thought was a parallel God case.
Right.
Am I right?
I'm not, I do want to distinguish them, Bruce. I'm not trying to distinguish them the way, I'm not sure that, in other words, I don't think that God's intentions there parallel with the mother, in the sense that, yeah, it's not like you can't cooperate in evil by not doing. I mean, some of our intentions are really a failure to act.
Yeah.
Then it's a kind of conscious failure. No, I'm not going to. I'm going to let this happen. And it would be wrong for us. It's wrong for her to do that, to just let this happen. We agree about that case.
So
with respect to God,
yeah.
I think it's different in the sense that when God permits this, which to us is sort of impermissible, there's no way a good being, never mind a perfectly good being, would permit this. We don't know enough to know that. As far as the human agent goes, well, no, you can't. It's not. I am not done. Okay, I want to say that no, the situation isn't parallel. That God does not contribute to the action, in his case, by not intervening in it. Partly because his not intervening is by itself doesn't contribute to the fact that the act can continue to occur, unfold, or whatever. His contribution is, he permits us to be free, therefore he permits us to be morally free, and therefore he permits us to do vicious acts to one another, even when they're really bad. It seems he doesn't intervene. How could that be permissible? Well, this woman, this mom, there's no way. She can't turn that into any good, as it were. Even if there's some good that comes out of it, like the little girl grows up and now she's a public, goes around speaking to other kids that have been abused or something like that. Of course, she is no longer with us. So is there something that God does for her now, right? She's not with us, but with him. Is there something that God can do now, or that is somehow caught up in, whatever, that does in fact allow God to permit it, even though it's not his evil, but it's an evil, right? It's suffering. And that's it's serious. There are serious cases of suffering where people can't live with it, right? Take their lives. They just feel you can't exist under that burden. I mean, and there are cases of suffering, like you say, the involuntary, the Holocaust, and I mean, you don't have to look at the Holocaust. If any of you saw that movie, The Act of Killing, did anyone see that? Talk about horrifying. Young kids being involved, being encouraged, just run around in gangs and hack people to death and strangle them, and these guys bragging, oh, we found a less messy way to kill people. At the end, one of them does have a kind of moral awakening in a way, comes to think maybe that wasn't so great as it seemed at the time. But obviously many of the people caught up in it think they're doing something terrific. That's horrifying, right? What happened to these people, the kids, the women, so you don't have to go very far to see things that are almost unimaginably horrible, and it's almost unimaginable that God would permit them, a good God would permit them. So I'm not denying that. I think the problem of evil for believers is maybe even more serious than for people who don't believe. I mean, people who don't believe say, well, here's one reason I don't believe, right? But in a way, they're off the hook, right? If you seriously believe in a God who's perfectly good, all-powerful, all-knowing, could in fact prevent these kinds of suffering, but doesn't, that's the problem. And I think it's more a problem for people who do believe in God, and it's a big one.
Well, on that note, can we thank the speaker?
That's kind of depressing. Thank you.